Poetry, in its own way, is ultimately mythology, the telling of the stories of the soul in its adventure on this earth.
Hello, welcome to this third and final day of our Poetry Symposium at the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. It's been a marvelous series of conversations, beginning with visits to the center virtually from a range of distinguished guests. Today we'll be featuring Chinmoy Guha and Alison James, and my curator, Avik Chanda, will do the honors of introductions and moderating the conversation. But I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone from the University of Chicago. My name is Srikanth Reddy. I teach in the English department, and I'm looking forward enormously to the conversation to come.
Great, Srikanth. Chiku, thanks very much for that introduction. And a very warm welcome to all our viewers across the world to this third and concluding session of the Poetry Symposium 2021. So without further ado, let me do a quick round of introductions and then we'll get started with the discussion. So Alison James is Professor of French at the University of Chicago. Her research and teaching interests include post-war experimental writing, the Oulipo group, theories and representations of everyday life, and documentary literature. She's the author of Constraining Chance, Georges Perec and the Oulipo, and also the documentary Imagination in 20th Century French Literature, Writing with Facts. She has also edited and co-edited volumes and journal issues on literary formalism, fieldwork literatures, and non-fiction across media, and has published several articles on contemporary poets such as Michel Martin, Jacques Roubaud, and Jacques Jouet. And with her, we also have with us Professor Chinmoy Guha, who is a professor of English and former chair at the University of Calcutta, and also the former vice chancellor at the Rabindra Bharati University. He has been previously the director of publications at the Embassy of France in India, and has served as the literary editor of Desh for over a decade, and has also served as a member of the jury for the Prix Romain Rolland since 2017. He has published several books in Bengali, English, as well as French. His works include Bridging the East and West, Rabindranath Tagore and Romain Rolland Correspondence, The Tower and the Sea, Romain Rolland and Kalidash Nag's Correspondence, his doctoral thesis, which has been republished by Primus recently, Where the Dreams Cross, T.S. Eliot and French Poetry, and that's something that we're going to be talking about, together with prodigious volumes of translation spanning all the way from Flaubert's Dictionary of Received Ideas to Gide's Trade is the Gate to Romain Rolland's Nata, La Rochefoucauld's Maxims, and several others. So he has been knighted thrice by the government of France and has received numerous awards in India as well, including the Vidyasagar Award and most recently in 2019, the Sahitya Academy. So very warm welcome to you both. As we were talking earlier, Alison, Chinmoy, I think the first thing that we could start off with would be to discuss what it is that drew you both. And Alison, I can start with you and then go on to Chinmoy. What it is that drew you to French poetry, because neither you nor Chinmoy, are native French speaker, and also you don't teach to people who are native French speakers either, right? So that entire transnational sort of interest, if you could talk to us about it.
Yes, well, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Avik, for this kind introduction, and thank you and Srikanth Reddy for curating this series. I've really very much enjoyed listening to the conversation so far. So as you may be able to tell from my accent, I grew up in the UK, although my accent may be slipping since I've lived in the US for a long time now. But so I grew up in kind of southwest England. My parents, I think, were very Francophile. We spent a lot of family vacations in France, actually in Brittany, near Quimper, which I think is a place that Rosanna Warren may have mentioned. This was the birthplace of Max Jacob, who is the subject of Rosanna Warren's magnificent biography. So I spent a lot of time sort of in Brittany and in Quimper. But I think really my relationship to French is a literary one. I think it was really through kind of teachers who introduced me at school to Molière, to Camus, sort of at an early age when I was learning French in school, and I think really I just developed a fascination for this literature. I was interested in literature in general, but I think it's something about kind of the kind of distance at a foreign language, kind of distance and proximity, I guess, that you can have when reading in a foreign language. The sense that you can sort of enter the novelty of sort of entering into this other other culture, this other language, and kind of I think the fascination that brought to me. So yes, I think it was really French literature that then kind of won me over, and I later went on to study French and German as an undergraduate at university. I spent time studying and teaching in France before coming to the US for my PhD, which was then in French literature. So yes, it is, and it is interesting to teach French poetry both in French and in translation to American students. But we can maybe come back to that question of how to approach that.
Okay, great. Chinmoy, you're on mute.
So, I live in a country which is actually one of the biggest language laboratories in the world. It's unbelievable that we have more than 1,600 languages. So we grew up like that. I mean, most of us are trilingual, or we spoke 4 languages. So we have this habit of growing up with other languages, with living with other languages. This is very interesting. And then, of course, there is in Bengal. There has always been a great fascination for France, even during the British Empire from the 19th century. France seemed to be part of an alternative discourse. I mean, it was a quest for an alternative discourse. One of the pioneers of the Bengal Renaissance in the 19th century, Raja Ram Mohan Rai, when he was traveling in a ship, he was told that a French ship was passing by, and he dragged his feet out. He drags himself out and saluted the flag of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So that's always there. Students of Presidency College, Hindu College, hoisted the French flag on the monument of Calcutta after the revolution of 1830. So there's always been a secret love affair. And if anyone had a choice, French was automatic, I would say. So I had an interaction with a very important Bengali poet called Urun Mitro, one of the greatest post-war poets. And he was a Francophile, and he was a great scholar of French language. He told me to learn French along with English, because English itself will not lead me anywhere. So I started learning it at the age of 20. Would you believe it? At the age of 20. And I was very impatient. I thought I would take years and years. I sometimes studied 22 hours a day. It was a real love affair. And then, of course, one fine morning, I thought I was progressing well, and French has remained, I would say, my mistress in a way. I teach English. That's my primary profession at the University of Calcutta. I write in Bengali, and I love to spend my time with the French dictionary. So that is my favorite occupation in the leisure hours. So that's my story.
And a lot more coming up. Alison, in your latest book, the documentary imagination in 20th century French literature, and if I've got it right, one of the main theses that you put forward is the fact that towards the end of the 20th century, there is an emphasis, an preoccupation, if not an obsession, with authentic details, with empirical facts, and that kind of leads away from fictional invention. So if that is the case, where does that leave poetry in the 21st century? I mean, you can start by talking about French poetry and then expand.
Yeah, this is a very good question, and you're touching on something which is slightly a sore point, which is sort of the place of poetry in my book, or its absence, because I feel that there is a place for thinking about poetry and documents, and this is maybe something I touched on in my book, but would have liked to explore more. So I'm thinking back to the modernists who did explore a certain kind of documentary poetry. So in Apollinaire, for example, you'll get sort of postcard poems when especially in Callicrame, he's famous for the kind of drawing poems, right? Apollinaire, but where the poems are kind of shaped, take on particular forms, but there you also get sort of postcard poems, which are kind of postcards back from the front, right, when he's fighting in World War I. So I think there is a kind of documentary tradition that you could trace back to that gesture of putting a postcard, a postcard poem in your collection. It takes a different form in poets like Blaise Cendrars, for example, who has a collection of poetry called Kodak. And he later claimed that he was threatened with legal action from the Kodak Eastman Company, so he had to change the title to Documentaire Documentaries. So there is this. There's also a kind of literary hoax at play, because he's actually, a lot of those poems are written using quotations. Actually, he's drawn from others, but he presents them as kind of direct documentary accounts of his travels. So Cendrars is an interesting case where you have a kind of an explicit sort of documentary poetics there, but that's also a little bit of a screen for some of what he's really doing with kind of found material, kind of reusing quotations. So I think there is this then thread that runs through French poetry. The more contemporary poets who are kind of in this tradition would be people like Emmanuel Ocar. I can think of others, but there is a tendency toward kind of using documents, or Jean-Marie Glaise, who uses photographs, for example, in his books of poetry. So yes, I think this is a question I'd really kind of like to come back to in my work, because I think it's a fascinating one. How do we understand this tradition of documentary poetry in France?
Okay, Chinmoy, you're on mute. You're on mute, and I'm going to actually take a quick cue from what you said, Alison. Working with found material. and reusing quotations. And Chinmoy, I'm going to see if that resonates with you when we are talking about T.S. Eliot, right? And I want you to really bring to life many of the things that you and I have I've certainly had the opportunity to learn from you during all our addas at the cafe, and even virtual ones, but the viewers haven't, right? And many of the landmark lines from T.S. Eliot's work, particularly the four quartets, in my beginning, in my end, etc., right, to be the landmarks of 20th century English literature, I was shocked, right? I was really way more than surprised to hear their original provenance. So why don't I, let you talk about the French influence on T.S. Eliot's work?
It was it was a rainy evening, and I was going through, just browsing one of the books of T.S. Eliot. It was called On Poetry and Poets. That was in the late 80s. And he said in his essay on W.B. Yeats, which was actually a lecture the first W.B. Yeats memorial lecture. And there he said that whatever he wrote came from French. Very clear, categoric. And that really put me on to a search, because I thought nobody had paid attention to this aspect sufficiently. I mean, there are 2-3 pages in almost every book on Eliot, but one never went beyond that. So I thought that maybe I should begin an inquiry which is more meaningful and significant, and which can lead to newer discoveries. And then I started my own research work, and it was good for me because I had some knowledge of French at that time. One's knowledge is never complete. It's not my mother language, of course, but if I'm chased by a tiger, I would perhaps cry in my mother language and not in French. But I was sort of mastering slowly the language. J'ai fait la nuit blanche, as they said. I had sleepless nights. I was studying hard, and I discovered similarities which were mind-blowing, which can sort of set the world on fire. So it's clear, because Alison was talking about modernism and the documentary value of the work, and Eliot too was doing the same thing. They were all updating the discourse. They were no longer speaking in the late 19th century poetic language, idiom. They were discovering new horizons, cracking the prevalent discourse. And Eliot did it in a way which is remarkable, but almost with vengeance. This man from the United States came over to France and then to England. And thank God he married an English woman and stayed back in England, much to the dissatisfaction of his parents. But he went on plundering, I would say. He said, he wrote a very famous essay in 1919 called Tradition and Individual Talent. And he himself was the best example of this, because he was very intelligently gleaning their work. I mean, he was using Baudelaire. He wrote 3 essays on Baudelaire, and his damnation was important for him, and the necessity of Christianity. The whole aspect came from Baudelaire, and he was using his lines. He was using Laforgue's lines. For example, this is my copyright, be careful. Laforgue wrote clip, clop, clip, clop, 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 clop. Eliot wrote drip, drop, 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 drop in the wasteland. Can you believe it? It's unbelievable. Well, if you go to, for example, when I was reading The Wasteland, I thought I'd read this somewhere. And I sort of, I rewound my memory and found that, yes, it could have been something from Valéry Larbaud, who was a great cosmopolitan writer. And I went to Valéry Larbaud's house, like a detective in Vichy, at the Bibliothèque Valéry Larbaud, and found books offered by Eliot. And he said that I owe so much to you. The whole world didn't know anything about it. Volumes of books on Eliot never mentioned this bondage, and there's surely a deep bonding between the two. So I thought he was using Valéry, Alison, you would know, les poésies de Barnabou, Barnabou. And so that was used extensively for creating this kind of new cosmopolitan poetry. And he was using lines like London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. These use of nursery rhymes came from Laforgue, who was doing the same thing. And for example, there was a line like "Tata, goodbye ladies, goodbye." It came from Laforgue's Hamlet, where Hamlet was distributing cigarettes to everyone, and then "Tata, goodbye ladies." So this man was deliberately doing it. I could call it plagiarism. He was almost kind of I would say, go to the extent of saying that it was a kind of kleptomania, literary kleptomania of some sort. He couldn't resist certain things. For example, he was using quotations. As Alison would know, in the early 20th century, he was extensively using epigraphs. In all his poems, in Prufrock, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, in The Wasteland, in The Hollow Men, everywhere. And these came from Laforgue, who was quoting copiously from the Elizabethan writers. And he moved towards Elizabethan through Laforgue, not the other way around. Very interesting. And when he wrote about Elizabethans and Jacobians, he was sort of taking a leaf out of Laforgue's page, maybe Dernier Vers or Complaintes et Complaintes. He was doing it. So it was almost a kind of return of the dead, like the return of Sherlock Holmes. It was the return of the dead because Laforgue died at the age of 27 in 1887, 1 year before Eliot was born. So I would say that the year when Eliot was conceived by his mother, Laforgue had died. It was a kind of reincarnation. And when, for example, he went on doing it. He went on doing it. I wish I had the book with me right now, but I don't want to sort of talk about Eliot only. But Eliot did it. And I wrote a whole book of Where the Dreams Cross. I could have criticized him, but I did not. I said, this is his creative process. He was using others much more than we think. For example, when he said, I'm a royalist in politics and a classicist in art, etc., and a Catholic he was actually lifting the line of Charles Maurras, who said exactly the same thing. Exactement la même chose. C'est fou, c'est complètement fou. So he was doing the same. This is sheer madness. And then I was reminded of an essay by Aldous Huxley, Madness, Badness, and Sadness. He was sort of mixing up everything. He was going through a depression at the time, and he was using all this. And for example, all of us, for example, the great Eliot scholars always say, no, Eliot became himself after a while. He was liberated from the French influence, etc. It's totally wrong, because I found that he was moving into the orbit of Claudel in the last phase. And I found his obituary of Claudel in the archives of Cambridge. And I discovered that he was using the long lines, the flowing orchestrated incantatory lines from Claudel. And I read in his biography that he was really buying books of Claudel. Very exciting. He was buying books. If you read Peter Ackroyd, he was buying Claudel, and then he was imitating him, and he never said anything about Claudel. Very clever man. Look at his politics. He never wrote on Laforgue. He never wrote on Claudel. Very interesting. But he wrote on metaphysicals. He wrote on Baudelaire.
Right.
Yeah, but he wrote somewhere 4 years before his death To Criticize a Critic, in a book called To Criticize a Critic, he said, I owe more to Laforgue than to any poet in any language. And he never wrote anything on Laforgue. So look at the politics, very, very clever, and I would say intelligently done. He was weaving a carpet. And he was converting everything, Alison and Avik, into fresh blood. This is very important. He was converting, like Apollinaire, like Blaise Cendrars, he was converting everything into fresh blood. This is his great quality. And
I just wanted to follow up on this, because this is really interesting. And I think what Chinmoy is mapping out here a little bit for us is this kind of territory of what I think you talked about cosmopolitan modernism, and I think this is exactly it. I think, you know, in France this gets obscured a little bit by the focus on the avant-garde and surrealism and all these others, but there's this other tendency, you know, that I think you can trace back to people like Laforgue, but, you know, also thinking about the place of people like Claudel, right, and a lot of these other figures that are being cited here. I think there is this whole kind of other territory, and it's often maybe this often kind of uses they often exploit this kind of text reuse, use of found materials. And then, you know, in the case of Eliot, it's very interesting, right? Because you have his notes, his annotations to the Wasteland, which disclose, you know, some of his borrowings, but this is a kind of smokescreen. I'm thinking about, you know, the way that I talked about Sandra as using the documentary or the photographic as a kind of screen to kind of hide what he's actually doing with the text, you know. So it's like, oh yes, these are documents, and it's actually no, well, something else is going on here. And I wonder if Eliot's doing the same thing with his notes. He's telling us some things, you know, some things are still in the French, right? You have the Nerval, le Prince d'Aquitaine, à la Tour Aboli in the Wasteland. You have some very explicit borrowings, and then all this kind of hidden kind of background that
explicit borrowings, like Fourmillante Cité of Baudelaire. He said it in the index, but he doesn't say anything about other things. Very, very well done. Very good mixing. And this is one way of, I think 20th century poetry is very important for us, because there was a fusion of horizons at the beginning of the 20th century. It was not like in the past when Beethoven and Wordsworth were born in the same year in 1770, but they didn't know each other. But in the early 20th century, in the modernist period, they all knew each other. One of the greatest friends of Picasso was Apollinaire. So the walls were broken, and there was a fusion of horizons, which I like very much. And I liked very much, Alison, your reference to cosmopolitanism, because cosmopolites in Greek, it means somebody who is a citizen of the universe. That is very, very important, who accommodates to all countries, to all customs and conventions. And that is why cosmopolitanism is a very important word. We all want to be cosmopolitan, and we started becoming cosmopolitan at the beginning of the last century, when Eliot and Descendras and Apollinaire and the Surrealists were writing. And Eliot used lines like tweet, 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 jug, 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 jug. He was obviously being influenced by the Surrealists, quite obviously, because they also use lines like, you know, fille, mère, mère, fille, fille, mère, mère, fille, fille, mère, lines like persienne, 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 persienne in Aragon. So he was using these things. He was doing it very, very intelligently. He was not writing surrealist poetry, but he was using surrealism. This is very, very exciting. Anyway, that is all. Just before I end, just one interesting information for all the audience and Avik and Alison, that we all know that Eliot at St. Michael's Church, East Coker, there is a memorial tablet of T.S. Eliot, because his predecessors came from East Coker, Somerset. And there is the famous line of Eliot from 4 quartets, "In my beginning is my end, in my end is my beginning." Great lines, but I discovered that in Tristan Corbier's Les Amours Jeunes, he was just lifting the line. And you might say it is a coincidence. It is not a coincidence, because I found in Cambridge that in a list of books that Eliot had in his library, this book, Les Amours Jaunes by Corbière, was very much there. So it sort of corroborates my view. Anyway, that's all. But it's a very interesting way of writing poetry. We're talking about poetry today, so it matches that.
A kind of collage poem in a way, yeah.
That's right. That's right.
And Alison, I was thinking if this would be a good time to segue from, you know, collages into translations per se. And you know, I wanted your views around, you know, working with translations, and later on we can talk about the teaching part of it. But just you know, your view about the translations. Day before yesterday, when we began the Poetry Symposium, Chico and I were talking with George Szirtes, and George has his favorite term when he talks about the degrees of fidelity whenever he approaches translation, the original text. And I was wondering, you know, if that kind of an ethos resonates with you, or what your approach is, what your views are on the authenticity and sort of veracity of translation.
It's interesting, and there are degrees of fidelity, yes, but there are also there are also choices. I would say sort of fundamental choices that translators have to make. I think this comes across very clearly in some of the very experimental writers I work on, like Georges Perec, who's famous for writing a novel, 300-page novel without using the letter E, this lipogrammatic novel. But he also writes. There's also this Oulipo group of experimental writers. The Oulipo is the workshop for potential literature. It's a group that was formed in France in 1960. But they'll do things like anagram poems, for example. So this very experimental poetry that actually for translators then poses this fundamental choice, right? Are you going to somehow translate the constraint, the gesture, the underlying gesture of the constraint? Are you going to write some version without a letter E, or produce your own poems using anagrams that are possible in English, right? Or are you going to try to write something that's faithful to the meaning of the original? So I think yes, there are degrees of fidelity, but there are also these just basic choices that are going to lead to very different results, just on the level of form. Yeah, I was just thinking about this. I mean, the most recently, I taught a class on European civilization, which is actually basically supposed to be a history course, but I managed to get some literature and onto the syllabus. So I ended up teaching Baudelaire in translation as a way of talking about the transformations of the city in the 19th century. So it was a kind of Paris-focused European civ course, and talking about the remaking of Paris, right, under the Second Empire. And using Baudelaire to talk about that. So there, again, so this is of course taught in English. Some of the students had French, most of them did not. So then I ended up using Keith Waldrop's translation of Baudelaire, which is a prose, a prose translation. It's actually what Waldrop, I think, calls a verset, which is a term he takes from Claudel. Somebody mentioned the verset, which is a sort of long sentence kind of form, a long line form, where each he turns. So Waldrop turns Baudelaire's stanzas into these versets. So he doesn't try to imitate the Alexandrine form, the kind of verse form of Baudelaire. He's trying to find his own form. So you could say that's it's not strictly faithful to the form, but actually works very well as a solution. It has its own rhythm, and so I think it's this kind of choice that I find very, very interesting to explore, sort of on the formal level in translation.
Chinmoy, you have translated extensively across, all the way from fiction to poetry to aphorisms, the entire range of literature from French into Bangla. And I would, at this point of time, invite you to talk about, the joys of discovery and also the challenges of translation. And with regard to what Alison said, right? What are some of the choices that you've had to make? With some examples, please.
Yes, because what Alison said is very important, and she teaches to the students. Therefore, she has a very, first-hand knowledge of how the translation works. Now, as far as I'm concerned, one thing is important. We are talking about poetry in the last two sessions too. Why poetry in a world where everything is falling apart and crumbling, and we are going through traumatic times, and we need poetry very much. And yesterday you were talking about the absence of poetry from literary festivals, etc., from the hullabaloo of the market. It's normal, because poetry is very, very personal. It's a very personal perception. You read it. When you are reading a poem, you are reading it in an island. I think there is much in poetry which is unsaid. Three words reverberate. There are echoes. So there are vibrations. There are resonances. So poetry is not for Tom, Dick, and Harry. I mean, it's a special kind of mentality to read poetry. So in this terrible world that we are living now, we love poetry. Can soothe us, perhaps. believe me, this is the only thing, when we read Amit's poetry yesterday, Avik, I really thought that it had a soothing, healing effect. It has a therapeutic effect. Poetry can. And I remember your father was a great actor in Szirtes cinema. He once told me that he read poetry in the morning because it had a therapeutic effect on him, on himself. That is very important. And in the deep of my heart's dark silence, I am thirsty of those echoes, the unsaid words, because life is full of unsaid words, silences, meaningful, pregnant silences. So that's it. And as far as translation is concerned, I think the world, and now after Corona, I think it's clearer enough that we are all desperately needing cross-cultural comprehension. We are desperately needing cross-cultural comprehension. We need a confluence of cultures. We cannot say, I live in my own island, you live in yours. You cannot. We have to stretch out our hands, and translation is the best way. And if you think carefully, all of us will remember that whatever we know, from Aristotle to Marx, to Tolstoy, to Dostoevsky, to Balzac, to Cervantes, to Kafka, to Umberto Eco, we have read
to the Mahabharata, to the epics, to even our own epics, right? The Ramayana and Mahabharata. I mean, I haven't read them in the original, right?
We read it in translation. So translators have done so much for humanity. We don't even know the name of the translator of many writers. Alison was talking about Camus. Same with us. This fascination for Camus' Outsider and the plague.
And the plague now, of course.
And the plague is going on right now.
Yeah.
The same kind of epidemic. So I was sort of charged by Camus, but not Camus. The version of Camus offered by Justin O'Brien. Because French has lots of things which cannot be transmuted, cannot be sort of transferred to English, which is a Germanic language, which is a masculine language, while French is a Romance language. And Alison knows very well because she teaches in the Romance language department. The beauty, the liquid flow of the Romance language doesn't come across all the time in a hard, stiff language like German or perhaps English. Now, to come back to what I was saying, it helps us to become more cosmopolitan. Translation is about vibrations, and I'd say I loved something something said by Rosanna Warren yesterday. Poetry is fundamental to our humanness. I think I loved the expression, and what is important is translation can try to transfer the idea. It's not easy. I was going through Beckett's own translation of his own poems just now, and I thought that he was not always using the same thing, because what is good in French may not be meaningful in English. For example, we all know about his great play, En attendant Godot, While Waiting for Godot. It becomes Waiting for Godot, because While Waiting for Godot would have been a very cumbrous name. En attendant Godot. Or Un temps. A time in his plays becomes a pause in English. But he doesn't use this in French because he used time. Time flows by. I think it's beautiful. But there are aspects which can be studied. No, I'm not going to Beckett right now. What I want to say...
Chimoda, I think Alison had a point.
Oh, I just wanted to jump in on Beckett, if I can, because I think the case of Beckett is really interesting because, what's the status of this kind of self-translation? It's not quite the same, it doesn't quite have the same status as a translation by someone else. And that, yes, you pointed to the linguistic differences, but there's also really interesting things I noticed, such as that actually the French version has different kind of geographical, historical references as well. This happens in Beckett's other books as well, where you're sort of in a French context in the French version with kind of references to various places in France. Actually get more of a reference to Beckett's kind of resistance activity, which I think is interesting, kind of coded, but in the French.
We do not did the same thing. Also self-translated, and Beckett did it all his life, because most English readers don't even know that Beckett's original writings are in most cases in French. And very interestingly, he writes in the first page, title page, translated from the original by the author. Very interesting. Translated from the original by the author. He could have simply translated it because it's his work and presented it like that, but he didn't do it. He mentioned the word translation. Anyway, you can move over because I was going through Beckett, one of his poems just now, and for example, a line like "Elles viennent hautes et pareilles, avec chacune ses hautes et ses pareilles, avec chacune l'absence d'amour est haute. Avec chacune, l'absence d'amour est pareille." And he says in English, they come different and the same, haute et pareille. Haute can be something else also, Alison. It can be other. So you see he's taking stand, taking position. He's using different and the same. With each, it is different and the same. With each, the absence of love is different. With each, the absence of love is the same. And I thought, avec chacune, l'absence d'amour est haute, may have had other connotations. So I don't know. Translation is a I would say humbling business. You know that you can't do everything. There are bubbles and scratches at all times. There are bubbles because after having translated poetry, I often tell myself that I could have retranslated it all the time. If I translate it 4 times, it'll be 4 different versions. And if talking about Baudelaire, I was reading Joanna Richardson's translation. It was horrifying. There's nothing to do with the original, nothing to do with the original. I feel very sorry for those who believe that Baudelaire is that. Or Buddhadev Boshu's translation, very, very archaic and very different from Baudelaire's original style. And Bengalis don't believe that, and they believe that he did a great job. So it's difficult to convince people, but that doesn't really matter. What is much more important that we're trying to stretch out. They're trying to find the resonance. They're trying to find the vibrations, to find that they're trying to strike the same wavelength. Avik, that's very important. A translator tries to go beyond the borders and strike the same wavelength with another mind in another culture, another semantic network. While you translate from French into English, it's easier because it's the Western syntax. The syntax is almost the same, sometimes different.
Sometimes it's easier. It's deceptive a little bit. Sometimes people think it's easier.
Yes, I agree.
People think it's easier, and it's not. It turns out not. It turns out not.
Not always. I know. But when you translate into Bengali, it's a totally different language.
It's a different thing. Yeah,
or Dravidian language, it is a different take altogether. So you see, it's a different take altogether. So that is very, very important. Translation is not simply commonsensical virtuosity. A translator is not a bonded laborer. It's not he must remember that he is a cultural pilgrim. A pilgrim of culture. He has his responsibility. He must enjoy what he's reading, but at the same time, when he would be looking for equivalences, he should always remember that he's performing a cultural duty to transpose a text from one language into another, and this is very important. As Srikanth reminded us in one of the emails, he said that is a new set of cultural and historical contexts. Because maybe Baudelaire wrote it in the 19th century, Racine in the 17th century. But now in our context, how to contextualize it? Will it become very old-fashioned, or will it become? Should it connect the blood vessels or not? Well, T.S. was doing it when he was translating the symbolists. I liked A.J. Cronin's.
Sorry. I think Alison's.
No. I'm just responding to this. This is really interesting. Yes. So you're talking about the responsibility of the translator, but I think it's also difficult, right? Because translation is often a very thankless task. I think you also pointed to this, Chinmoy, the fact that we don't know who a lot of the translators are. In a lot of these works. So. I was thinking about this, and another example from the Beckett would be he has a short story called Le Dépeupleur, which is translated as he translates as the Lost Ones, I think. But the Dépeupleur, it's this idea of unpeopling, and it's a great term. So in a way, the Lost Ones is a completely different idea. But right. I just wanted to jump in and ask about your own practice of translation then, Chinmoy, and how you choose which poets to translate, because I know we're focusing on poetry here. Is it kind of your initiative? Are these kind of commissioned? I know the French embassy sometimes kind of supports certain translations, right? And then, so what motivates those particular translations, and then what kinds of difficulties, challenges you've faced?
Very good question, Alison. I would like to know about your admiration for Michel Métaï and Jacques and Jouet. And I know they are all Ulupi writers, belong to that group, and you wrote about Perec and that movement group. Anyway, to come back to what I was saying and what you asked, no, because in my case, Avik and Alison and my and the audience, I'm lucky because whenever somebody trusts something on me, it doesn't work. Because a translator has to respect the contract. There's a contract between him and the writer. He cannot go on his own. He has to respect the contract. We have the great example of Maupassant's necklace, which doesn't exist in French, of course. It is in French. It's not le collier or necklace. It is la parure, which is very, very different. Outward ornament or whatever. So it is the outward garment, dress, whatever. So it's not the same, but there was a betrayal. There's a breach of trust by the translator who changed a philosophic message of Maupassant's story into a kind of trivial narrative about a necklace. So translator can betray at any time. I know that it's a tightrope walking. You write 3 sentences correctly, and the 4th you fall down because it's c'est de la marche sur la corde raide. It's like tightrope walking, and if you make a mistake, you can always make a mistake. And I agree with Derrida that you can't blame the translator because he's always wrong. What is important, Alison, as you know better than me, is that one must love the man you are translating. And even if the embassy once trusts on me the job of translating Bernard-Marie Coltès' La solitude dans les champs de coton, Solitude in the Cotton Fields, a play by Bernard-Marie Coltès, a playwright who became very, very important at one stage, who died of AIDS later on. And I translated. My father told me, it's terrible. It's terrible. I can't read a line. Why did you translate this gibberish? Because I never liked it. It did not I couldn't locate it in India. An Indian audience will not be able to understand that kind of existential crisis. They can respond to Camus, the outsider. They can respond to some other writers, but they cannot respond.
Chinmoy, I'm going to interject here for a bit. What I would like you to share with us is a couple of maybe examples where you read out the original and also the way that you've translated it into Bangla. Maybe at least 1 or 2 examples.
Yes, Alison, just one thing. I have a feeling that a translator of poetry fails because he's not a poet. I'm sure you also wrote poetry when you were a teenager. We are all poets somewhere deep down, and I was a poet. Don't tell anyone. I was a poet once upon a time, and I wrote poetry, and then I told myself that I should add to the garbage. So I stopped. But I can assure you, good idea. Everybody should thank me for that. And so what important is I translated. Not because I liked it. A very important question, Avik and Alison. I loved them. Therefore, it was a contract. I respect. When you don't love or respect someone, you cannot translate him. You have to have a bond. You have to have some kind of an inner inclination. You must have an inner contract. You want to connect with him and the world beyond the borders. So that is why when I translated La Rochefoucauld's Maximes, believe me, I regarded the Maximes as little poems. I sculpted them for hours and hours and days, one-liners. I worked on them like a poem. Same with Dictionary of Stupidity of Flaubert, Aham Manke Robitan in Bengali. I worked on every line as if it's a poem. And when I translated poetry, I'm just giving an example, as Avik said, just quickly, because Alison has much to say, I'm sure. We have to learn a lot from others. This is a poem by Paul Éluard in French. Tu te lèves, l'eau se déplie. Tu te couches,
l'eau s'épanouit. Tu es l'eau détournée de ses abîmes. Tu es la terre qui prend racine et sur laquelle tout s'établit. Tu fais des boules de silence dans le désert des bruits. Tu chantes des hymnes nocturnes sous les cordes de l'arc-en-ciel. Tu es partout. Tu abolis toutes les routes. Tu sacrifies le temps à l'éternelle jeunesse de la flamme exacte. Femme, tu mets au monde un corps toujours pareil, le tien. Tu es la ressemblance. Look at the limpidity, look at the tenderness. I think all Elua's poems are love poems. His you, collective you. I mean, he became a communist later on, but this is fantastic. The tenderness, la tendresse, and the intimacy of this. And I tried to do it in Bengali. I would have liked to read it in English, but I don't have time. The translation, I'm just finding out. Just give me a second. Sorry for that.
Limpidity is a nice way to think about it. I'm thinking about.
তুমি উঠে দাঁড়ালে জলের ভাঁজ খুলে যায়। তুমি উঠে দাঁড়ালে জলের ভাঁজ খুলে যায়। তুমি শুয়ে পড়লে জল পুষ্পিত হয়। তুমি জল যা খাদের কিনার থেকে ফিরে আসে। তুমি মাটি যা শিকড় প্রসারিত করে, যার উপর সবকিছু দাঁড়িয়ে। শব্দের মরুভূমিতে তুমি ছড়িয়ে দাও নিঃশব্দের বুদ্বুদ। তুমি গাও রাত্রি স্তব। রামধনু রেখা নিয়ে সমস্ত রাস্তা মুছে দিয়ে সব জায়গায় তুমি। তুমি সময়কে ছুঁড়ে ফেলেছ আগুনের শিকার অনন্ত যৌবনের জন্য, যা প্রকৃতিকে ঢেকে দেয় তাকে নতুন করে ফিরিয়ে আনবে বলে। নারী, তুমি পৃথিবীকে দিয়েছ এক শরীর যা কখনো বদলায় না। তোমার, তুমি নীল, tu es la ressemblance. But having done this, Alison and Avik, I feel that in French it is tu es la ressemblance, and in Bengali I said tu me nil. It's beautiful in Bengali, but you know the sound structure of the original doesn't come off in Bengali. Tu es la ressemblance. It's quite something, but it becomes much shorter in Bengali and doesn't have that kind of evoke that kind of echo which is in the original. So it's a struggle all the time. We're talking about Apollinaire's zone. Believe me, in English it is zone, but in Bengali it is onchol or ilaka, which is horrifying. There is no equivalent word. What do? You surrender. So these are the problems. You try your best, but it doesn't really work. It's a tightrope walking, as I said. And another very important, while it is not easy to adopt the soul of the author because you constantly intervene. We always like that. We always say that the best translation, the dominant aesthetic is transparency, but fidelity to the author, etc., etc. Very interestingly, when T.S. Eliot translated Saint-Jean-Per's Anabase in 1930, it was a free translation. And he was lambasted by Saint-Jean-Per's. And so he went on in the second edition, he was much more faithful. So we hover between the two. It's a bipolar discourse. On the one hand, you are faithful to the original. On the other hand, you are you. After all, Justin O'Brien puts in through the text of Namu. So one tries one's best to suppress that self. But it sticks out at times. That's the main issue, and that's the main problem, I think, everywhere in the world: reduction, exclusion, and inscription. So this illusion of transparency is perhaps an impossible job, but one carries on. The fight is on. The fight is on.
I mean, what I'm hearing here is a real attention to the resonance of words as well, and I think that's really, really interesting. The ressemblance and both kind of the rhythm, the length of the word, what that brings. But I'm just thinking about the very different challenges you would face with all the writers you talked about there, with La Rochefoucauld, where you really have this precision, right, of vocabulary that you have to capture. With Flaubert, where there's a kind of irony, and kind of maybe different voices you have to convey. And and yes,
Yeah,
then with Elu again. So
it's an exciting thing,
yeah.
very exciting.
I always feel like a bit of an imposter talking about translation. I always say I'm not a translator, but I end up doing little bits of translation. I think maybe as an academic, for students sometimes, and sometimes for academic articles I'm writing where I have to translate. I really struggled with Jacques Jouet's documentary poems, for example, where he's using very specific literary forms, and I was trying to, translate them again for academic purposes so that I could actually comment on the language, but also somehow respect the form. And that's really a different kind of challenge, perhaps. But.
Yes,
and
right.
And Alison, we're coming sort of close to stoppage time, but there's another theme that I wanted to take up with both of you, and that we haven't had a chance to talk about as yet, and that's the teaching of poetry, right? So teaching of French poetry in the original and in translation, and Chinmoy, in your case, teaching English poetry as well to literally generations of students, right? But as Chinmoy said, we're living in times where there's huge amount of disruption, and a lot of the disruption is technology sort of driven, and that means that even our medium, our modes of expression, I mean, think of Instagram, think of Twitter, has become far more reductive than it would have been 20 years back or 30 years back, right? So when you're teaching people in their late teens, early 20s, and those are people who don't hear the music, hear the melody, hear the nuances, the fine nuances of any language, let alone a foreign language, right? How do you get them enthused to the craft and the music of poetry?
Yeah, I can try to answer that a little bit, talking about my own teaching experience. I mean, I think it's what the tricky thing is. On the one hand, I think that poetry is fundamental. As Rosanna Warren said yesterday, I really believe this. I think it's sort of fundamental for sort of understanding the world, our way of relating to the world. So I think students need it. But I think also, I mean, here I'm talking about the teaching in the American context. I find that students are scared of poetry almost, and there's this real obstacle. And they think it's some kind of coded language that they can't understand, that there's something inaccessible about it, that they have to. So I think what I end up trying to do is I think with it, this is a good thing, that teaching poetry sort of forces you to be kind of creative in your teaching in a way and come up with new kinds of activities. But I try to actually make them pay attention to to the surface of the text. So it's not about sort of necessarily, decoding some hidden meaning or some hidden symbolism that's not there. Just paying attention to the words that are on the page. So I think it was Amit Chaudhuri the other day yesterday who talked about, he quoted Mallarmé talking to Degas, right? Mallarmé said to Degas, poems aren't made out of ideas, Degas, they're made of words. And I know I push back on that idea a bit, but I think this is actually a useful reminder for students. It's actually, no, you can do something with these words. And that's where I think using exercises like just translation as a teaching exercise is really useful, using kind of constraint-based writing sometimes, which is what a lot of the writers I'm interested in do, but having students kind of try out some of these constraints, but also things like listening to kind of musical settings of poems. I've done that a lot when teaching sort of intro to 20th century poetry, French poetry. There are a lot of musical settings of Aragon, for example, of his poems, and having them kind of compare those musical settings, having students kind of compose their own poetry anthologies with poems with poets who are interested in this. So this kind of thing, just to try to demystify poetry a little bit, I think, for the students.
So to kind of like approach them, maybe sometimes through other media, maybe even through films, for example. Right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I haven't done it through film so much, but I think there are ways you could do that. Actually, I think there's a course called Poetry in the Human I've taught. I know Chiku's actually taught it too. It's one of these core classes, the Hume 101 classes that Chiku parodies so brilliantly in his latest book of poetry. But yes, it's Poetry in the Human, where we do end up incorporating film, for example, to think about film as a kind of visual poetry. So that is So some of these kind of city symphony films, for example, in relation to Whitman, you can do things like that. So yes, I think that's also one approach that's and sound. And having students listen to, say, Apollinaire reading there's a recording of Apollinaire reading his own poetry, for example, which students are always a little bit surprised by because they find that he has a very sort of monotonous way of reading, but that in itself is sort of interesting to delve into. Why is he reading this way? He has a kind of reading that's really emphasizing the form, right? The kind of in his reading of, Le Pont Mirabeau, I should have brought a recording, but it's something like Sous le pont Mirabeau coule la Seine, and it's just not the kind of poetry reading perhaps that students are accustomed to, but that's also an interesting question.
And of course, I mean, I know we've talked enough about T.S. Eliot, but it just reminded me, T.S. Eliot reading the Wasteland, T.S. Eliot reading the Four Quartets, as opposed to, say, Alec Guinness reading the Four Quartets, right? And the completely different verve to it. And even the greatest of the poets, right? I mean, T.S. Eliot, you hear him for like 10 minutes and it's difficult to continue, perhaps, right? But with Alec Guinness, you can just immerse yourself in the melody of the words, because his voice itself is so mellifluous, and the way his voice carries over. Chinmoy, we've come right to the end of it, but we definitely want your more than your views, your steer, because literature itself perhaps is under siege here in our academia, in our institutes here in India, and you and I have spoken often about this. How do you, in such a milieu, right? How do you make poetry come alive to young people? Students?
I think the audience question is very, very important for us. I think it's very important. Alison appreciated it when you discussed about it. The audience question is very, very important, because who are we translating for? Who are we reading the poetry to? This is important. This is important. I am very thankful to you for raising this question. And otherwise, it makes no sense. Why are you translating if you don't forget the audience? And what Alison said just now is very, very important. There's a secret fear that the language is very difficult. It's a code. And so what I do is, I have not taught French poetry, but I've given lectures, of course. I've written extensively on the poets, to modern poets, basically. But when teaching in the class, I remember what Alison said just now. It's the same experience. I go into the poem and I read the poem. When you read the poem, you have the feeling of the poem. Somebody asked me, you teach poetry, but you never read the poem in the class. You don't have the feeling of the poem in its entirety. The beauty of it all, the sound, the resonance. Somebody yesterday asked a question about the music of poetry. The music of poetry, it is always there. Eliot wrote an essay called The Music of Poetry. The music of poetry is always there in all the great poets, from Baudelaire to Rimbaud and to Michaud and René Char and Roubaud. So what is important is I try to sort of transfer it into their minds, the vibrations, try my best, and I then crack the code little by little and go inside, and then they become part of the work. They identify with the work, and this is what I've tried to while teaching Coleridge and Eliot in the class. Thank you.
Okay. Great. We've just gone beyond the time, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you both very much. This has been a wonderful, really, really engrossing session, Chinmoy and Alison, and I'm sure our readers, our viewers here have absolutely loved it. This concludes our 3-episode or 3-part series for the Poetry Symposium 2021. But for the benefit of the viewers, let me again remind you that we are planning on something very exciting, very ambitious. We want to come back in a bigger, broader way in March 2022 with a poetry festival called Canto. And as the name Canto suggests, it would be a festival that's dedicated to poets, by poets. So, and hopefully we'll see each other long before that in other events. Stay well, thank you, and hope you enjoyed the Poetry Symposium. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.